Cold-hearted millionaire CEO tries to buy a boy's silence. His answer leaves her speechless. Dear friend, before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and make sure these stories find their way to you. The Langley estate stood like a monument to triumph and isolation, its tall iron gates forever half closed, as though the world was permitted to glimpse but never truly enter. Inside, Margaret Langley, once hailed as the most formidable financial strategist of her time, moved through the cavernous halls of her mansion like a ghost in her own life. At 71, her wealth had become both her armor and her prison. The marble floors gleamed under the weight of solitude, the chandeliers sparkled coldly above, but no laughter echoed within these walls. Her fortune had been built on acquisitions and decisive corporate strikes, many of which had left smaller institutions gasping for breath. She was known for buying faltering hospitals, stripping them of what little value remained, and repurposing their properties into luxury ventures. In the financial world, she was revered and feared in equal measure. But behind the iron discipline and the boardroom victories, Margaret carried an invisible weight, a hollow ache that no success could silence. Her only son, Thomas, had not spoken to her in over 15 years. Their final argument had been volcanic, an irreparable fracture between a mother who worshipped efficiency and a son who begged her to see people, not just profit. In the years that followed, she told herself that he would return, that silence was only a tactic in a negotiation he would eventually lose. But the silence endured. It became the quietest yet most brutal opponent she had ever faced. Each night, Margaret's immaculate routine dissolved into restlessness. Sleep eluded her like a debt unpaid. She would rise in the early hours, pacing the grand study lined with leather-bound volumes she no longer read. On her desk, a bundle of letters, unopened, unanswered, unsent. They were drafts, apologies she had written to Thomas but never dared to mail. She would trace her fingers over the ink, as if the weight of the paper might bridge the distance she had created. One particular morning, when the sunlight pressed insistently against the stained glass windows, Margaret made a rare decision. She would step outside. Not for charity, not for obligation, but simply to breathe air that was not perfumed by polished mahogany and freshly cut lilies. The streets were unfamiliar to her now, raw and untidy compared to the sterile precision of her estate. She had almost convinced herself to retreat when she saw him, a boy no older than 11, sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk. His clothes were worn, his blonde hair unruly, catching the afternoon light as if spun from gold itself. In front of him, a piece of cardboard bore the words, "Help save St. Clair Hospital." Margaret's first instinct was to walk past. Sentiment had no place in the life she had meticulously constructed. But as she stepped forward, the boy lifted his gaze and called out to her, not with desperation, but with sharp, unwavering clarity. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "numbers can save lives too." The sentence sliced through her with unexpected force. She halted, meeting his steady hazel eyes flecked with green and amber, eyes that sparkled, not with plea, but with challenge. Intrigued despite herself, Margaret approached him. The boy, Leo, unfurled a series of papers, hand-drawn yet startlingly precise. Pie charts, expense breakdowns, financial flowcharts scribbled in pencil. "St. Clair isn't really bankrupt," he explained quickly. "The numbers don't match the reports. Look here, the supply costs spiked without explanation. And here, the debt repayment schedule, manipulated. Someone's closing it on purpose." Margaret's breath tightened. The boy's logic was crude but not wrong. She recognized the pattern, the same ruthless tactics she had once applauded in her own boardrooms. She narrowed her eyes. "You speak as if you understand balance sheets." Leo's chin lifted. "My mom worked there before she passed. I've been following the reports. I know you're buying it. You're taking away the only place that helps kids like me." The accusation, spoken with such innocent certainty, hit Margaret in a place she thought long closed. In Leo's defiance, she saw a flicker of someone else, a boy she had once known, who had also begged her to see beyond numbers. Thomas's face flashed through her memory, young and furious, on the day he walked away. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, but the words rang hollow. Leo didn't flinch. "Then prove me wrong. Check the numbers with me. If I'm wrong, I'll stop asking. But if I'm right..." His voice wavered only slightly. "Then you'll have to help us." There was something about him, something too stubborn to dismiss. Margaret felt the walls she had so carefully built tremble, just a fraction. "I don't have time for games." "Neither do the kids in that hospital," Leo shot back. His boldness, his refusal to cower before her wealth, ignited something dormant within her. She turned away, but his words followed her like a shadow. Back at the mansion, the stillness pressed in on her more aggressively than usual. Margaret summoned her assistant, Helen, and requested a comprehensive financial report on St. Clair Hospital. Helen, accustomed to Margaret's brusque commands, said nothing as she hurried off. But when she returned hours later, her expression betrayed something rarely seen in their world: unease. "There are inconsistencies, Margaret. Significant ones. It appears the debt was intentionally inflated by one of the investment funds we manage." Margaret's heart pounded, not from guilt, but from something far more dangerous: doubt. For years, she had believed in the cold purity of numbers. Now those same numbers threatened to unravel her carefully preserved empire. "Who's behind it?" she asked, though a part of her already knew. Helen hesitated. "Daniel Cole's division, one of our most aggressive arms." Of course. Daniel, the very executive she had trained to cut deeply, to win at all costs. She had created him. And now he was replicating the very strategies she had once championed. Margaret rose from her chair with measured deliberation. Her gaze, once cold, now flickered with something that almost resembled purpose. "Find the boy," she ordered. For the first time in years, Margaret Langley was stepping out of the safety of her fortress, not to secure a profit, but perhaps to reclaim something far more valuable. The next time Margaret Langley saw Leo Bennett, the boy was not seated on a sidewalk, but standing by a worn hospital bed, gently adjusting the blanket over his little sister's frail shoulders. It was not the bustling boardroom, nor the pristine lobbies she was accustomed to. The St. Clair Hospital, already half-emptied by the looming acquisition, now echoed with the quiet hum of resignation. Walls once painted in bright colors had dulled. The scent of antiseptic clung to every surface, as if trying, in vain, to cleanse the decay of neglect. Margaret paused at the doorway, unnoticed for a moment, as Leo tenderly stroked his sister's pale hair. There was a weight in his small shoulders, a responsibility no child should bear, yet he carried it without complaint. When their eyes met, Leo straightened, his expression guarded but not afraid. "You came," he said simply. "Curiosity is a dangerous habit," Margaret murmured, stepping inside, her heels clicking softly on the linoleum floor. Leo tilted his head, unconvinced. "You don't seem like the kind of person who wastes time on curiosity." Margaret almost smiled, but the habit of restraint was too deeply ingrained. Instead, she gestured to the folder clutched in his hand. "Show me what you have." They sat in the corner of the sterile room, just outside his sister's earshot. Leo unfolded a stack of worn papers and tablet printouts. They were crude but astonishingly accurate. "These are the supply orders. If you track the vendors, you'll see the hospital paid triple market rate on paper. But the goods never arrived. The payments went somewhere else." His small finger traced lines of numbers as if reading poetry. Margaret's gaze followed, realizing with a cold pang that his conclusions weren't guesses, they were sound. The patterns of theft were unmistakable to someone who had once orchestrated similar maneuvers. And here, Leo continued, flipping another page with careful precision. The debt repayments were reshuffled into a fund that doesn't exist. On the books, the hospital bleeds. But in real life, it was strangled. Margaret's throat tightened. The strategy was too familiar. Someone in her corporation had engineered this. Someone who had learned from her. She studied Leo, marveling at his untrained brilliance. "Where did you learn to read financials like this?" My mom used to clean the accounting offices, he replied softly, his eyes distant. Sometimes she'd bring home papers to review because she wanted to find a way to keep her job when they started cutting costs. I sat with her. I asked questions. She showed me. After she passed, I kept reading. The silence between them thickened. Margaret felt an ache she could neither categorize nor suppress, a strange mixture of pride and shame. This boy, who should have been playing soccer in some park, was dissecting corporate fraud with the precision of a seasoned analyst. "Why didn't you take this to the authorities?" she asked, though she suspected the answer. "I tried," Leo said, with a weary shrug too old for his age. "I sent letters. I asked to speak at the board meetings. They didn't even let me through the door. No one listens to a kid with crumpled papers." Margaret's gaze darkened. She knew the system was built to silence voices like his. She had helped build it. "You're clever, but you've made a mistake," she said coldly, reaching into her purse and sliding a thick envelope across the table. "You can't fight this. You're outmatched. Take this and walk away. It's more than your mother earned in 5 years." Leo didn't even touch the envelope. "I don't want your money." "Everyone wants money," she countered, her voice like glass. "Not me." His eyes locked onto hers, steady, fearless. "I want the hospital to stay open. I want to finish what my mom started. I want people to stop using numbers to hurt other people." His refusal landed like a stone in her chest. For years, Margaret had believed that everything could be bought: loyalty, silence, even redemption. But this boy had just outbid her. For a moment, the steel in her melted. Something stirred, a faint, uncomfortable warmth she could neither dismiss nor define. "Fine," she whispered, her voice fraying at the edges. "Show me the rest. All of it." And so began their uneasy alliance. Margaret started reviewing the documents Leo had painstakingly gathered, her mind reluctantly drawn into the web of deceit he had uncovered. Late into the night, she cross-referenced vendor lists and combed through financial records her own company had deemed irrelevant. Helen, Margaret's longtime assistant, observed the shift with a rare flicker of surprise. She found her employer buried in spreadsheets, not profit reports, but Leo's tattered files. "Margaret," Helen said cautiously one morning, "you've never personally reviewed these kinds of transactions before. Why now?" Margaret offered no explanation, only the softest reply. "It seems I've overlooked some important variables." Helen's brow furrowed, but she said nothing more. Something in Margaret's eyes told her not to push. As the days passed, Margaret found herself waiting for Leo's calls. They met regularly at the hospital cafeteria, in quiet corners of the city, on park benches where Leo would bring his sister's coloring books and draw charts in the margins. He challenged her, poked holes in her logic, and occasionally surprised her with connections she hadn't yet considered. "You're wasting your talent here," she told him once, half mocking. Leo just shrugged. "I want to be a statistician someday. Not to work for people like you, but to stop people like you from winning so easily." Margaret had no retort. His ambition, so pure and so stubborn, left her oddly breathless. One afternoon, Leo invited her to walk through the pediatric wing. Margaret hesitated at first, but curiosity tugged at her more insistently now. As she moved past the small beds, the faces of the children began to imprint themselves on her memory. The numbers she had once seen as clean and absolute now wore faces, fragile, smiling faces that carried the quiet terror of being forgotten. In those sterile halls, something long buried within Margaret began to stir. She realized she had found something she hadn't expected to search for, something real, something worth the risk. For the first time in decades, Margaret Langley was fighting not to win, but to save. For most of her life, Margaret Langley had believed that numbers were the only honest language left in a fractured world. They didn't tremble. They didn't lie. They didn't beg. But now, sitting across from Leo Bennett in the sunlit corner of the hospital cafeteria, she realized numbers could also bleed. "I'll help you," she said at last, her voice low, firm, and carrying the weight of decades. but we will prove this methodically. No decis, no leaps. Every decimal must be accounted for. Leo's eyes lit up with a mixture of triumph and relief. I've already started. I just need someone who can get me to the right files. Margaret's lips twitched, almost into a smile. That's not going to be a problem. And it wasn't. Within days, her private offices filled with boxes of contracts, spreadsheets, vendor invoices, and digital files Leo could only dream of accessing on his own. What surprised her wasn't the depth of the deception. It was Leo's ability to navigate it. He pored over the numbers with an intensity that rivaled her own, tracing line items and payment trails with the precision of a born auditor. There's something strange here, Leo muttered one afternoon, his small finger darting across the spreadsheets. These companies, look, they're all part of the same group. They're selling supplies back and forth at inflated prices, creating fake expenses. Margaret's brow furrowed as she leaned closer. Circular invoicing, she whispered. A classic shell game. Leo looked up at her, his hazel eyes burning with the fierce satisfaction of discovery. It's not just neglect, it's theft. His conclusion was unshakable. Still, Margaret knew the corporate machine would demand more than the musings of an 11-year-old prodigy. She needed irrefutable confirmation. Quietly, she reached out to Samuel Briggs, a man she hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Samuel was a retired auditor, renowned for his brutal honesty and his refusal to bend to power, even when that power had been hers. They met in a quiet park, away from watchful eyes. Samuel was older now, but the sharpness in his gaze remained. After hours reviewing the documents Leo and Margaret presented, he closed the file with a grave nod. This isn't negligence, Margaret. It's a deliberate, orchestrated fraud. She exhaled slowly, as if the confirmation had somehow made the burden heavier. Will you help us? You mean, Samuel said, his voice tinged with humor, will I help the queen of corporate takeovers burn down her own castle? Margaret's gaze didn't falter. Yes. He agreed without hesitation. But as Margaret and her unlikely team pressed forward, resistance grew inside her empire. Rumors began to swirl. Emails went unanswered. Doors that had always opened for her were suddenly closed. She sensed it in the clipped tones of board members, in the carefully worded memos from Daniel Cole, her most aggressive executive, once her protege, now her shadowed adversary. They wanted her quiet. They wanted her compliant. They would not get it. Leo, meanwhile, proved to be more than a boy with a stack of papers. He showed Margaret a rudimentary algorithm he had built using an open-source software on an outdated tablet. It can flag suspicious payment patterns, he explained, shyly but with quiet pride. It's not perfect, but it's a start. Margaret watched in astonishment as his crude but functional code cross-referenced vendors, dates, and payment amounts, unearthing anomalies she herself might have missed. You built this yourself? She asked, genuinely impressed. Leo shrugged, his cheeks flushing. I just didn't want them to get away with it. For the first time, she felt a pang she couldn't ignore, a desire not just to protect his findings, but to protect him. The world he was stepping into was dangerous, filled with people who would silence a threat like him without a second thought. Their investigation led them to a single document buried under layers of misfiled reports, a simulated contract never meant to be seen, authorizing the siphoning of hospital funds into a shell company. Leo stared at it, breathless. This is it. This is the smoking gun. Margaret carefully slid the paper into a protective sleeve. It's more than that. It's proof they were never supposed to leave behind. Helen, who had watched Margaret's transformation with cautious wonder, now fully committed herself to their cause. She reached out to a young lawyer, Marcus Rayner, known for defending community hospitals and going head-to-head with corporate giants. He's stubborn, Helen warned, but he's honest. That's exactly what we need, Margaret replied. As the case solidified, Margaret found herself teetering on the precipice of an impossible decision. Protect her assets and her lifelong reputation, or risk everything to bring the scheme to light. There was no going back. Not now. In those long nights spent poring over data with Leo, a tenderness bloomed between them, hesitant at first, then quietly steadfast. He began to call her the Lady of the Good Numbers. The first time he said it, Margaret almost laughed, though her throat tightened in a way that surprised her. Perhaps it was the childlike reverence in his voice. Perhaps it was the realization that for him, she had already changed. When Leo wasn't looking, Margaret began writing letters again to Thomas. Words she had once buried now spilled onto the page. Apologies, regrets, fragile invitations to a conversation that had been silent for too long. But the letters remained sealed in her drawer. She hadn't yet found the courage to send them. And then one evening, as Leo packed up his charts and prepared to leave, Margaret finally understood something. Leo didn't just need an ally in his fight against corporate corruption. He needed someone who genuinely believed in him, someone who would not walk away. "You'll meet me tomorrow?" Leo asked, his voice casual, but the faint tremble betrayed his hope. "I will," she promised, her voice firm, steady, and this time deeply sincere. "We finish this together." The next morning, Margaret stood before the board of shareholders, her decision clear. She would face them. She would confront Daniel Cole, and she would stop the acquisition. Because for the first time in years, the numbers mattered, but not nearly as much as the boy who believed she could be something better. The boardroom was colder than Margaret Langley remembered. It was the same sweeping expanse of polished mahogany, the same floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sterile view of the skyline she had once conquered, but something had shifted. Perhaps it was not the room that had changed, but her. The men arrived on time, as they always did. They wore dark suits, polished shoes, and the unmistakable air of certainty that came from years of unchecked power. Daniel Cole entered last, his confident stride betraying not the slightest trace of unease. He sat directly across from Margaret, his smile razor-thin. She had called this extraordinary meeting, not as a queen summoning her court, but as a woman determined to tear down her own fortress. "We have reason to believe," Margaret began, her voice as measured as the ticking of the antique clock behind her, "that the financial collapse of St. Clair Hospital was engineered. Funds were siphoned through a network of related entities. Vendor invoices were inflated. Supply chains were falsified." A murmur stirred among the executives. Margaret pressed on. "I am demanding the immediate suspension of the acquisition." Across the table, Daniel's eyebrow arched with theatrical surprise. "You demand," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Forgive me, Margaret, but it sounds as though you've been misled." "I have the reports," she said firmly, her hand resting on the folder Leo had helped compile. "Preliminary, but damning." Daniel chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Damning? Based on what? The math of a child?" The insult landed softly, but deliberately. Margaret's hand tightened on the folder. "This isn't about a child," she replied. "It's about integrity." "Integrity?" His voice laced with mockery. "I must admit, it's a bit disorienting to hear that word from you. You taught us that numbers win, that people are replaceable. Are you telling us now you've found a heart?" The room fell painfully silent. Margaret's gaze hardened. "Perhaps you should ask yourself why this is the hill I've chosen to die on." Daniel's smile faltered just briefly. He knew. She saw it then, behind his calm facade, the faint glimmer of recognition. Daniel was not just defending the acquisition. He was defending himself. He was implicated. The board began to shift uncomfortably. Murmurs grew louder, not out of concern for the hospital, but for the disruption Margaret was causing. "We have procedures, Margaret," one director finally said cautiously. "The acquisition has already been approved by majority vote. If you insist on this deviation, the board may have no choice but to consider your removal." "And perhaps you should," Margaret shot back, her voice growing colder. "But I won't stand by and let this corporation crush what little good remains in that hospital." The room recoiled slightly, not used to Margaret's candor, nor her refusal to play the careful game of appearances. Later that day, back in the safety of her private office, Margaret sat with Leo and Samuel, the weight of the meeting pressing against her ribs like iron bands. "You went too soon," Samuel warned gently. "We need more. You need to corner Daniel so tightly that not even the board can protect him." Leo, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his tablet balanced on his knees, added softly, "If we can map the payments across all the shell companies, we can prove the fraud mathematically." Margaret's eyes flickered with gratitude. She knew the path would be longer, harder, more dangerous, but she had already chosen. She would not retreat, even if it meant sacrificing her own empire. "Then we continue," she said, "even if it costs me everything." Helen, tireless and quietly fierce, worked late into the night tracking hospital records. It was she who finally located a potential witness, a hospital procurement officer, terrified but willing to speak anonymously. "His name won't appear," Helen promised, "but his testimony could tip the scale." Meanwhile, Leo meticulously built a model, a web of transactions, arrows, and numbers so simple and clear that even the most hardened board member would have to admit the scheme's impossibility. They spent long afternoons together, Leo and Margaret, sometimes in silence, sometimes swapping stories they had never told anyone else. Leo spoke of his mother, of the hospital that had become his second home, of the fear that his sister's treatment would simply vanish. Margaret, in moments when her defenses lowered, told him about Thomas, her son she hadn't spoken to in years, the boy she had loved fiercely but lost to ambition. One crisp morning, as sunlight painted long golden lines across her study, Leo looked up from his notebook. "You remind me of the stories my mom used to tell. About knights. Except you're not fighting with swords." Margaret allowed a rare smile. "And what am I fighting with?" "Numbers," Leo said with quiet conviction. "But this time, you're one of the good ones." He had begun to call her that, the lady of the good numbers. It unsettled and comforted her in equal measure. Without telling him, she had already arranged for a private medical fund to secure his sister's ongoing treatment, no matter what happened. It wasn't charity. It wasn't guilt. It was something else, a thread of responsibility, a quiet act of protection she never expected to offer anyone again. Their bond, once built on suspicion and necessity, softened into something that neither could fully name. She would never admit it aloud, but Leo was becoming the grandson she never had. One evening, as Leo prepared to leave, his hand paused on the door. "Promise me," he said, his voice small but insistent, "that you won't let the important men take this away." Margaret met his gaze, her voice low but unshakable. "They may be important, but they're not more important than you." It was a promise she intended to keep. And when the time came, when the final confrontation loomed, Margaret knew exactly where she would stand, not beside the men who measured worth and profits, but beside the boy who had taught her to count again, not in numbers, but in lives. It was a rainy afternoon when Helen found it, a file buried so deep in the archives that even Margaret Langley, with her exacting memory, had forgotten it existed. For hours, Helen had combed through stacks of dusty contracts, storage boxes, and misfiled annexes that someone, deliberately or not, had left in disarray. What she stumbled upon wasn't a contract, nor a balance sheet. It was a letter of intent. Faded at the edges, the ink softening with age, the document outlined a binding agreement made years prior, one that explicitly restricted the acquisition of St. Clair Hospital under certain financial protections. Protections that, had they been honored, would have prevented the current sale entirely. Helen's heart pounded as she scanned the final paragraph. The letter had never been registered, never made public. It was legally binding, but it had been carefully tucked away under layers of insignificant paperwork, as if someone had meant for it to disappear. Without wasting a second, she rushed to Margaret's study, where the older woman sat quietly, reviewing Leo's newly drafted charts. Margaret looked up, puzzled by Helen's breathlessness. "What is it?" Helen placed the letter on the desk, her fingers trembling slightly. "I think this changes everything." Margaret read the letter once, then twice. By the third reading, her composure cracked, just briefly, in the smallest flicker of her steady hand. "This is real?" she asked, her voice low. "It's real," Helen confirmed. "It was hidden deliberately." They summoned Samuel immediately. The retired auditor examined the document with the scrutiny of a surgeon. He cross-referenced it against transaction dates and corporate bylaws. When he finally looked up, there was a rare gleam in his eye. "This letter invalidates the current acquisition process," Samuel said, tapping the signature at the bottom. "If we bring this to the Financial Ethics Council, it won't just delay the sale, it will expose the fraud." Margaret closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. There was no more room for hesitation. "We'll take it public," she decided, "before the hospital is officially transferred, before Daniel has time to bury it again." But Daniel Cole was never one to be easily outmaneuvered. It wasn't long before he caught wind of Margaret's quiet movements. In an act of desperate strategy, he approached Samuel privately, offering him what Margaret would later describe as a sum substantial enough to buy not just a man's silence, but his conscience. Samuel refused, without theatrics, without negotiation. "Some things aren't for sale," he told Daniel coldly before walking away. The rejection solidified Samuel's place at Margaret's side. Their alliance was no longer a question of profit or strategy, it was a matter of dignity. As preparations for the corporate conference intensified, Leo confronted his own private battle. Speaking in front of people terrified him. He had always been dismissed, ignored, told to sit quietly while adults decided his fate. The idea of addressing a room full of powerful executives left his palms clammy and his voice trapped in his throat. But Leo had come too far to retreat now. "I'll do it," he said to Margaret one evening, his voice wavering but firm. "I'll explain the numbers. They'll listen if I make them simple." Margaret looked at him, pride softening her otherwise austere features. "You don't have to prove anything to them, Leo." "Yes, I do," he whispered. "They have to hear it from me." Margaret agreed, though the thought of exposing him to Daniel's ruthless tactics gnawed at her. Helen, ever the vigilant guardian, soon delivered a warning. "Daniel's preparing to discredit you," she said. "I've seen the memos. He's going to attack your credibility, paint you as a woman losing her grip." Margaret felt the weight of it immediately. She knew that playbook because she had written it. She had once built her career by crushing opponents, turning their weaknesses into weapons. It was a brutal game, and now she was the one in its crosshairs. But this time, she wouldn't run from it. Margaret and Leo spent long hours rehearsing their presentation. Together, they created clear, accessible visuals, simple charts, colorful graphs, even analogies Leo thought other children could understand. "Keep it honest," Margaret told him. "Make the truth impossible to ignore." Their late-night sessions often dissolved into quiet conversations about things that had nothing to do with spreadsheets. Leo spoke of his sister's favorite songs, his mother's stories about fairness, his dream of becoming someone who could make numbers protect people instead of harm them. Margaret, in return, told him of the empty wings of her mansion, of a son she had driven away, of letters she had written but never sent. She had begun to see Leo not as a project, nor as a cause, but as something far more fragile, a boy who had cracked open the shell of her isolation. Quietly, without his knowledge, she had set up a private fund to guarantee his sister's long-term care. It was the first personal investment she had made in decades that had nothing to do with profit. One morning, as the conference loomed just days away, Margaret walked the halls of her vast estate. The rooms, once trophies of her success, now echoed like hollow chambers. The oil paintings, the marble statues, the shelves lined with untouched books, all of it seemed smaller, less significant. The walls that had once comforted her now pressed in around her like a quiet accusation. That same evening, she finally did what she had long postponed. Sitting at her antique desk, she composed a letter to Thomas, this time not a draft, not a plea left unsent. She invited him to the conference, not with the expectation of forgiveness, but with the hope that he might see who she was becoming. Her handwriting, though steady, trembled with each word. The night before the conference, Margaret and Leo found themselves sitting in her garden, under the quiet canopy of twilight. The weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily upon them, but in that moment, neither spoke of numbers, nor strategies, nor Daniel Cole. They simply sat together in silence. Leo picked at the grass, then glanced up. "Do you think it'll matter?" "It already does," Margaret answered softly. "Because we're not doing this for them. We're doing it for the ones they forgot." Leo's small hand reached for hers, his grip firm. No grand declarations were needed. They had come this far not as a billionaire and a boy from the margins, but as two people who had found in each other the courage to stand against the room of important men. The Grand Hall of Langley Enterprises, usually reserved for celebrations of corporate triumphs, was transformed that morning into an arena of curiosity and quiet hostility. Rows of polished chairs quickly filled with the city's most influential executives, major shareholders, ambitious journalists, and the occasional onlooker drawn by the scent of scandal. The stage, normally draped in sterile banners of success, now waited for something far less predictable. Margaret Langley watched from behind the velvet curtain, her hands steady, though her heart beat an unfamiliar rhythm. Beside her, Leo adjusted his small tie with trembling fingers, and Samuel offered a quiet nod of reassurance. "It's a room of important men," Leo whispered, his voice thin but determined. Margaret bent slightly to meet his eyes. "And today they'll listen to you." The crowd murmured as Daniel Cole ascended the stage first, flanked by his closest allies. His confidence was palpable, his tailored suit a perfect match for the carefully controlled narrative he was about to spin. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel began, his voice calm and rehearsed, "we are here to affirm what has always been our mission: growth, expansion, and the strategic rescue of failing institutions. The acquisition of St. Clair Hospital is not only legitimate, it is essential for the future of this company and for the community it serves." There were nods in the audience. His delivery was flawless, his lies perfectly woven, until Margaret Langley stepped onto the stage. The room fell into a brief, almost reverent silence. It had been years since Margaret had spoken publicly, and fewer still since she had been seen as anything other than a distant figurehead. But she was not alone. At her side, Leo Bennett carried a folder nearly as tall as his chest, and Samuel Briggs moved with the quiet strength of a man who knew the weight of the truth. When Margaret spoke, her voice was firm, every syllable etched with conviction. "For years," she began, "I believe success was measured in acquisitions, in quarterly reports, in the speed with which we could consume. I taught this company to win. But today, I'm here to tell you that we've been winning the wrong battles." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. She unfolded the letter Helen had found, the forgotten document. "This letter of intent, drafted and signed by our legal division years ago, renders the acquisition of St. Clair Hospital not just unethical, but illegal. The protections outlined here were never dissolved. They were buried." Daniel's mask of composure remained, but his knuckles whitened where they gripped the podium. Margaret continued, "This hospital was targeted. Funds were siphoned, invoices manipulated. I will not stand by and allow the legacy of this company to be built on the graves of the vulnerable." She stepped aside, her gesture deliberate. "Leo, please." The room shifted uncomfortably as Leo approached the microphone. A boy, an interloper in a domain reserved for power brokers. But as Leo spoke, his voice gained strength. His charts, projected onto the massive screen, told a story that no one could dismiss. He explained with surprising clarity how the payment loops were constructed, how the hospital's debts had been fabricated, how a web of shell companies had been orchestrated to bleed St. Clair dry. Some gasped. Some scribbled furiously in notebooks. Others simply stared at the boy, who had dismantled a multi-million-dollar scheme with the innocent brilliance of someone who believed that numbers could save lives. Daniel seized the moment. "Are we truly to believe," he scoffed, "that the foundation of this accusation rests on the analysis of a child? This is desperation, Margaret. Surely you see that." But Margaret was unflinching. "He is not just a child. He is the reason I am standing here." The tension tightened as the screen flickered to a live video feed. The anonymous hospital employee, voice disguised, appeared and confirmed everything. Dates, transactions, orders that never arrived. It was irrefutable. Then Samuel stepped forward, his reputation undeniable, presenting the final evidence. The payment trails, the forged vendor lists, the mathematical model Leo had built that made the fraud impossible to explain away. The weight of the room shifted. It was no longer on Daniel's side. Questions from shareholders fired like arrows. How long have you known about this? Were you complicit? What happens to the hospital now? Daniel faltered under the barrage. In the back of the hall, Thomas Langley sat silently, his heart pounding as he watched his mother, this woman who had once chosen power over him, stand for something that could cost her everything. Daniel made one last attempt. In the quiet corridors behind the stage, he approached Margaret with a final offer, a private settlement, a fortune beyond measure, and most importantly, silence. You can walk away from this, Daniel hissed. Keep your legacy intact. Keep your fortune. No one will know. Margaret studied him, and for a fleeting moment, she saw a younger version of herself reflected in his ruthless precision. No, she said, the word like a stone in her throat. Not this time. Her choice was clear. Even if she lost her empire, even if she stood alone, she would not be bought. When the board reconvened for an emergency vote, the decision was unanimous. Daniel Cole was stripped of his position. The acquisition was reversed. The hospital would remain open, its future now guarded by the foundation Margaret had quietly begun to build. Relief settled over her like an old, worn coat. The war was far from over. There would be lawsuits, financial battles, the long, grueling process of repairing what had been broken. But she was no longer afraid. She turned to Leo, whose small hands clutched the now wrinkled folder of evidence. Today, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, you saved more than just a hospital. Leo looked up at her, his hazel eyes wide and steady. You saved me. And for the first time in years, Margaret Langley truly meant every word. The applause from the conference still echoed in the walls of Margaret Langley's mind, but the silence that followed was far heavier. There was no celebration waiting for her when the cameras stopped rolling. No familiar comfort in the polished boardrooms that had once been her dominion. In choosing to expose her own empire, she had severed herself from the very machine she had built. The headlines bloomed with sharp contrasts. Billionaire betrays her own company. The fall of Langley's Ice Queen. A mother redeemed? Some called her brave. Others a traitor. The financial world, confused by her choice, debated whether she had lost her edge or finally found her soul. Margaret ignored most of it, but one name lingered in her thoughts, louder than the rest: Thomas. She hadn't heard his voice in 15 years. Their last words had been weaponized, sharpened by years of resentment. When she mailed the invitation to the conference, she didn't expect him to come. And yet, as she stepped into the quiet corner of the hospital's courtyard days later, there he was, her son, standing beneath a row of autumn-kissed trees, hands buried in the pockets of his coat. His face had aged in ways she had only imagined. The boy she remembered had grown into a man with edges she no longer recognized, and yet his eyes, the stormy gray that mirrored her own, were achingly familiar. "Thomas," she breathed, her voice betraying a tremor. He turned to her slowly. "I wasn't sure I'd come," he confessed, his voice measured but heavy. "But then I saw you standing next to that boy. You weren't the woman I remembered." Margaret took a cautious step forward. "Maybe I wasn't the woman you needed me to be." A bitter smile flickered on his lips. "No, you weren't." The weight of that truth settled between them like an old wound, freshly opened. "I put numbers before people," she admitted, her gaze steady. "I put them before you." His jaw tightened, his silence stretching long enough to bruise. "But then I met Leo," she continued, the name falling from her lips like a soft confession. "And he made me see what I couldn't." Thomas's posture eased only slightly. "The boy who made the world listen." She nodded. "He saved me from myself." A long silence passed before Thomas spoke again. "I needed you to fight for something that couldn't be bought. You finally did. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something like a beginning. Slowly, they began to reconstruct the fragile bridge between them, plank by hesitant plank. They spoke of his life, of the years they had both spent apart, of the cold seasons they had endured on opposite sides of the same grief. Margaret found herself listening more than she spoke, a skill she had never honed until now. Yet, as the days unfolded, Margaret noticed something in Leo's eyes, an uncertainty, a fear that quietly crept into his shoulders whenever she paused too long in thought. One evening, while they sat reviewing papers in her study, Leo finally asked, "Now that the hospital is safe, am I still part of this?" His voice cracked just enough to fracture her heart. Margaret set her pen down, folding her hands to steady herself. "Leo, you are not here because of the problem. You're here because you matter to me." His shoulders sagged in quiet relief, though he didn't quite know how to respond. He simply resumed his work, the bond between them silently fortified. Helen and Samuel, now fully committed to the mission that had outgrown its first victory, proposed the next step, creating a foundation to protect other hospitals from falling prey to the same predatory cycles. "We can't save every hospital," Samuel cautioned, "but we can build a system that watches the numbers, that teaches others to see what you and Leo saw." Margaret didn't hesitate. "Let's build it." She made the decision to redirect a substantial portion of her wealth, not as a donation, but as an intentional shift of purpose. No longer would her fortune be an armor. It would become a tool for justice. But the past, she soon realized, rarely lets go without a fight. Daniel Cole, stripped of his power, but not of his influence, began to maneuver in the shadows. Rumors surfaced, anonymous tip-offs to the press, quiet efforts to erode Margaret's credibility. It was an old game, and he was playing it with the same ruthlessness she had once admired. But this time, she was not alone. Thomas, who had once walked away from her empire in disgust, now returned, not to reclaim his inheritance, but to stand beside his mother. He offered legal strategies, media counsel, and the kind of resilience that had once separated them. "I'm not here to save your name," he told her plainly. "I'm here to protect the work you're doing now." It was more than Margaret had dared hope for. And then there was Leo, who, with his signature stubborn brilliance, proposed something she hadn't considered. "What if we teach other kids? Not just about math, but about how to see through bad numbers? About how to protect their schools, their homes, their communities?" Margaret's heart swelled at the thought. They began drafting plans for educational programs, for workshops that would equip children to decode the financial games that so often harmed the most vulnerable. As the foundation slowly took shape, Margaret found herself shedding pieces of her former life with quiet purpose. She walked the halls of her mansion with a sense of farewell, realizing that the cold grandeur no longer held her captive. Her legacy, she now understood, would not be written in the language of profit margins. It would be etched in the lives she helped protect, in the boy who taught her to count differently, and in the son who found his way back to her. One afternoon, as they reviewed the first draft of the Foundation's charter, Margaret turned to Leo, her voice unusually soft. "You know, Leo, I used to believe the most valuable things in life could be measured, but you've shown me the best things can't be counted." Leo's grin was shy but bright. "You just needed better math." She laughed, a sound that surprised them both. They worked side by side until the sun dipped low, knowing that though old wounds remained, they had begun to heal. And perhaps Margaret thought some things, some people, were worth starting over for. The name St. Clair no longer stood as a symbol of defeat or desperation. It became the banner under which a new legacy would rise. In the weeks that followed the public exposure of the fraud, Margaret Langley dedicated herself, with a fervor that surprised even her, to the creation of the St. Clair Foundation, an institution born not from strategy, but from purpose. The Foundation's mission was bold: to protect vulnerable healthcare institutions from financial predation, to watch the numbers that so often slipped through the cracks, and to teach others, especially the young, that knowledge could be a weapon in the defense of the defenseless. At the heart of this new beginning stood Leo Bennett. Margaret didn't just offer him a scholarship. She gave him a seat at the table. Leo was officially named the youth ambassador of the foundation, his role carrying weight and responsibility far beyond his years. His future was no longer a question mark floating in uncertain air. It was now a carefully built path, paved with Margaret's unwavering support. When she told him of her decision, Leo's eyes shimmered with something he had tried to conceal: relief, perhaps, or the cautious beginnings of belonging. "You really think I can do this?" he asked softly, clutching the folder of proposals he'd drafted in his childlike handwriting. "I don't just think it," Margaret replied. "I know it. You've already done more than most adults ever dared." Helen accepted Margaret's invitation to lead as executive director of the foundation. For years, Helen had been the loyal hand behind Margaret's most complex transactions. Now, she would step into the light, determined to steer this ship with a compass set on transparency, justice, and tangible social impact. Samuel Briggs took charge of technical training programs within the foundation, designing courses for young people like Leo, teaching them how to read the language of finance, how to uncover hidden patterns, how to hold institutions accountable. "Numbers don't lie," Samuel told his first class, "but people do. You must be sharp enough to hear the difference." Margaret's world, once sterile and meticulously controlled, bloomed with unfamiliar faces: students, hospital workers, community leaders, and children who reminded her of Leo. She no longer moved through meetings with the hunger of acquisition, but with the quiet satisfaction of building something that would outlast her. The rift with Thomas, though not entirely mended, softened as they worked side by side to structure the foundation's legal frameworks and protection mechanisms. Where once their conversations had been punctuated by silence and unspoken wounds, now they found rhythm in a shared mission. Thomas watched his mother with cautious admiration. In his eyes, she was no longer the woman who had traded family for fortune. She was someone else now, someone he could stand beside without bitterness. "Why now, Mother?" he asked her one evening as they finalized a community partnership contract. "Because I've spent a lifetime building walls," she answered, her voice distant but steady. "It's time I built doors." Margaret sent invitations to hospitals across the country, urging them to join the St. Clair Protection Program, an initiative offering financial oversight, education, and legal defense against predatory acquisitions. Communities responded. For the first time in decades, Margaret was greeted not with suspicion, but with gratitude. She had become, despite the shadows of her past, a figure of trust. Leo, meanwhile, began to step into his role with remarkable grace. He attended interviews, spoke at conferences, and became the unexpected voice of a movement. Children wrote him letters. Parents thanked him. Reporters marveled at his clarity. He didn't crave the attention. He simply understood the weight of his story. "I want kids to know they don't have to be afraid of big words or big people," Leo said in one interview, his voice firm but kind. "If you learn how to see the numbers, you can protect what matters." But the past does not surrender quietly. Daniel Cole, though stripped of title and influence within the corporation, worked tirelessly in the background. Through old allies and shadowed connections, he attempted to strangle the foundation's progress. Disinformation campaigns surfaced. Legal threats emerged. His fingerprints, though faint, stained the pages of every obstacle they faced. Margaret's resolve did not falter. When a new fraud attempt was uncovered at a small community hospital, the foundation acted swiftly. Leo, now armed with confidence in Samuel's guidance, led a public analysis of the financial scheme. His presentation was clear, his data undeniable, and his voice, still young but unmistakably strong, resonated across newsrooms and social platforms. Margaret watched from the back of the hall as Leo dismantled the web of deceit with the same quiet brilliance that had first stopped her in the street. She felt an ache she hadn't expected. Pride, yes, but also a profound sense of being exactly where she was meant to be. The community, once hesitant, now embraced the foundation as a genuine force for protection. Hospitals began to request audits. Families turned to them for guidance. Leo became a symbol not of corporate rebellion, but of possibility. One afternoon, Margaret found Thomas alone in the foundation's library, reviewing grant applications. "You've changed," he said, his tone thoughtful. "You see people now. You choose them." Margaret's throat tightened. She knew he wasn't just talking about the hospitals. "I didn't know how to before." "You do now." In the quiet that followed, she felt something settle, a weight she had carried for years beginning to lift. Without fanfare, Margaret sat in her study that evening and composed a new will. She penned with deliberate clarity that a substantial portion of her estate would pass directly to the St. Clair Foundation. The mansion, the assets, the power she had once hoarded, it would all serve a purpose far greater than her name. She didn't need a dynasty. She needed a legacy that could not be measured in quarterly earnings. Margaret's life, once dominated by marble halls and boardroom battles, now found its refuge in smaller, richer places. The hum of Leo's laughter as he explained algorithms, the warmth of Thomas's quiet partnership, the steady companionship of Helen and Samuel. Their dinners, once formal and perfunctory, became simple meals where conversation flowed with ease. In these ordinary moments, Margaret discovered an extraordinary truth, that the family she thought she had lost had quietly returned to her, reshaped by trust, by time, and by the courage to begin again. She no longer counted success in assets or acquisitions. Now she counted in lives. The battle was not over. If anything, Margaret Langley soon realized it had merely changed its shape. In the quiet aftermath of the conference, as the St. Clair Foundation gained momentum, Daniel Cole reemerged, not on stages, not in headlines, but in courtrooms and legal filings that arrived like cold daggers on her mahogany desk. Daniel had gathered a coalition of former allies, shareholders who saw the collapse of the acquisition not as justice, but as betrayal. He filed a lawsuit of staggering proportions, accusing Margaret of breach of contract, defamation, and fiduciary sabotage. His aim was not simply retribution, it was her ruin. The documents were clear. The lawsuit sought damages so vast that it would dismantle Margaret's personal fortune and dissolve what influence she still held in the business world. Helen and Samuel pored over the paperwork, searching for weaknesses, their expressions growing heavier with each passing hour. "He's smart," Samuel muttered, frustration lining his voice. "He's found every legal thread he can pull." "We might be able to shield the foundation," Helen said cautiously. "But you, Margaret, you could lose everything." Margaret sat motionless at her desk, the weight of the years pressing into her shoulders. She had spent a lifetime fortifying her empire against this very vulnerability. She had always believed she was untouchable. Now she understood the price of standing on the right side of the line. Thomas entered the room quietly, the court filings already in his hands. "I'll lead your defense," he said without hesitation. "But you need to understand, the cost could be steep. We could lose the house, the estate, your remaining stakes." Margaret looked up at him, her gaze steady. "If I back down, I keep my fortune but lose my name." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He had seen her make the wrong choice once. He would not watch her make it again. That night, Margaret walked the familiar halls of her mansion. The same gilded frames, the same echoing chambers, but they felt different now, like relics of a life that no longer belonged to her. In the study, Leo sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching something in his notebook. When he noticed her watching him, he patted the empty space beside him. "You know," he said, flipping the page to reveal a rough diagram of the foundation's financial structure, "what we're building, it's worth more than all your houses." Margaret's throat tightened. His words struck her more deeply than he could possibly understand. "Do you really believe that?" she asked. Leo looked up, his hazel eyes filled with a clarity that made her ache. "Yeah, I do. You always told me numbers don't lie. Well, the numbers we built, these numbers, are good ones." It was as if Leo had already accepted the loss of her wealth without fear, without sorrow. In his world, what mattered had already been secured. Margaret smiled faintly, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Then I'll fight. For this. For us." The public battle ignited swiftly. The lawsuit was high profile, plastered across newspapers and discussed with fevered curiosity on news panels. Some accused Margaret of self-sabotage. Others hailed her as a symbol of corporate conscience. Her face, once synonymous with ruthless acquisition, now stirred complex conversations about redemption, power, and accountability. Thomas led the defense with quiet precision, navigating a legal maze that would have broken lesser men. He understood that their goal was not to crush Daniel entirely, but to preserve what mattered most: the foundation, the mission, the fragile trust of the people they now served. Throughout it all, Leo remained at the heart of the fight. He spent hours building a public-facing presentation, simple, clear, accessible, that broke down the foundation's finances and operations. He wanted people to see the numbers, to understand that transparency was not a tactic, but a promise. At the press conference, Leo stood before a crowd of reporters, holding a tablet that displayed the foundation's financial model. "This is how we work," he said calmly. "No hidden fees, no secret transactions. We protect what matters, and anyone can check our numbers." His quiet defiance resonated far beyond the microphones. Behind the scenes, Daniel Cole's influence began to erode. His allies distanced themselves. The market turned cold. His name, once a pillar of aggressive growth, became a cautionary tale of ambition without integrity. In the courtroom, the final ruling arrived after months of excruciating deliberation. It was a partial victory. Margaret would lose her estate, her remaining shares in Langley Enterprises, and a significant portion of her wealth. But the foundation, its mission, its resources, and its legal standing would remain untouched. She walked out of the courtroom not as a billionaire, but as something far more rare: a woman at peace. The cameras swarmed, the questions rained down, but Margaret's answers were steady. "Some things are worth more than an empire," she said, "and I finally chose them." The foundation flourished in the aftermath. Communities rallied. Hospitals signed onto the protection program in growing numbers. Leo's work became a model for a new kind of youth-led oversight. Margaret often found herself sitting in the modest office they now shared, watching Leo argue passionately over new proposals, watching Thomas negotiate on behalf of small hospitals, watching Helen and Samuel train the next generation of watchdogs. The house was gone, the holdings dismantled, and yet she felt richer than she ever had. One evening, as the golden light of dusk filled their small conference room, Margaret turned to Leo, her voice soft and thick with unspoken gratitude. "You've taught me to invest in what really matters." Leo's grin was wide and earnest. "Took you long enough." They laughed together, the sound full and free, as if the walls they had both once carried had finally fallen away. Margaret had once believed her legacy would be carved in stone and steel. But now, it was written in something far more enduring, in lives protected, in trust rebuilt, in a boy who had taught her that the greatest investments were those measured not in profit, but in people. The auditorium hummed with anticipation. For the first time, the St. Clair Foundation's Congress was not just a dream or a battle cry. It was real. Hospitals, educators, community leaders, families, and young people gathered from across the country, drawn by the ripple of something that had begun with a single boy sitting on a street corner with a cardboard sign. The banner above the stage read, "The power of numbers, protecting what matters." Margaret Langley stood at the side of the stage, watching the seats fill. Her journey had been long, lined with sharp turns and painful reckonings. Yet today, the weight that had clung to her shoulders felt lighter, as if her wealth, now mostly gone, had simply melted into purpose. Helen, Samuel, and Thomas moved with quiet determination, each playing their part as directors of the foundation, each carrying the thread of a story that had long since outgrown its origin. But it was Leo who commanded the day. When he stepped onto the stage, the room hushed. He looked out at the sea of faces, some skeptical, some eager, all waiting. He began simply, "I used to think I was invisible." His voice trembled at first, but as he told his story, the hospital that almost disappeared, the numbers no one wanted to see, the day he stopped Margaret Langley on the street, his voice grew steady. He spoke not just of fraud and spreadsheets, but of his mother, of the lessons she taught him between folding laundry and studying invoices late into the night. She told me that numbers can be walls or they can be windows. I decided to use them as windows to see what others wanted to hide. The audience sat spellbound. Margaret, standing quietly backstage, felt her chest tighten as pride, grief, and gratitude all converged at once. Leo's story was not just his own anymore. It belonged to all of them. With a breath, he turned to the future. I want to help create something bigger, a national program where kids like me can learn how to protect their schools, their hospitals, their neighborhoods. I want to build a network of junior financial detectives. He paused, his youthful sincerity disarming. Because when you know how to see the numbers, you know how to protect what matters. The hall erupted into applause, not polite but real, sustained, warm, and rising. Margaret wiped a tear before it could fully form. It was a strange, beautiful thing to be honored, not for dominance, but for surrendering the life she once thought was her greatest achievement. When she was invited on stage, the applause deepened. She was no longer the feared tycoon. She was a woman who had turned toward the light, even when it cost her almost everything. In her speech, she chose honesty over elegance. I didn't come here today as the person you remember from the headlines. I'm here as someone who got it wrong, over and over. But life has a way of handing us a second chance, often in the smallest of hands. Her eyes drifted toward Leo, who smiled up at her, his entire being a quiet testimony to her transformation. Margaret continued, "Some of you may wonder why a boy's voice was louder than the walls I built around myself. It's because he taught me the kind of math that matters, the kind you feel, not just the kind you prove." As she stepped down, the foundation surprised her with an award, a quiet recognition of her courage to change direction midstream. Daniel Cole, of course, was nowhere to be seen. But some of his former allies were present, sitting silently, watching as the narrative they had tried to bury rose beyond their reach. They saw now that the foundation's success was not a fleeting rebellion, it was a movement. The press, once eager to brand her a traitor to her own empire, now chronicled her as a figure of rare evolution. Headlines read, "From power to purpose, and the rise of the numbers that heal." In a quiet moment after the ceremony, Margaret found Leo backstage. His tie was slightly crooked, his notes tucked under his arm. She held out a small velvet box. Leo's brow furrowed. "What's this?" Margaret opened it to reveal a simple gold ring, worn with age, but gleaming in the soft light. "This belonged to my grandfather," she said. "It was passed down to me when I took over the company. I used to think it symbolized ownership, territory, power." She paused, her voice softening. "But now, I want you to have it for something much better. For trust, for belonging." Leo's eyes shimmered, and he slipped the ring onto his thumb, where it fit loosely, but perfectly enough. "Thank you," he whispered. In the crowd, Thomas approached, his once distant gaze now warm with quiet pride. He and Margaret embraced, not the formal gestures of business allies, but the genuine, tentative hug of a mother and son finding their way back to each other. "It's good to see you here," Margaret murmured. "It's good to be here," he replied. "For the right reasons." Together, they watched as the next generation of financial guardians assembled, students, teachers, young volunteers eager to learn how to see through deception, to fight for what was right. Samuel smiled as he reported that the foundation had received an influx of applications from teenagers wanting to follow Leo's path. The impact was growing, rippling beyond what any of them had dared to imagine. In the final moments of the event, Margaret returned to the stage for a closing address. "There's something extraordinary about second chances," she told the crowd. "Not just the ones life gives us, but the ones we choose to give ourselves. I spent years building things that would end with my name. Today, I build something that will outlast me. Something that belongs to all of you." Her words resonated, not because of their grandeur, but because of their hard-earned simplicity. As the applause filled the hall, Leo quietly reached for Margaret's hand. Their fingers intertwined, a small, unspoken gesture that radiated through the room, stirring hearts more profoundly than any speech could. It was not a transfer of wealth, but of legacy. And when the curtain finally fell, they stood side by side, not as savior and saved, not as billionaire and orphan, but as two people who had rescued each other in the most unexpected of ways. The towering glass walls that once served as the headquarters of Langley Enterprises no longer echoed with the brisk footsteps of brokers or the clipped language of aggressive deals. Where once Margaret Langley had presided over an empire of acquisition, now stood the Langley Bennett School of Ethical Finance, a place where the sharp edges of profit had been softened into tools for protection, education, and social good. Margaret's decision to convert her former corporate citadel into a school had stunned many in the financial world. The name engraved on the entrance wasn't her own. It was Leo's, the Bennett School for Ethical Finance and Social Justice. Dedicated to Leo and his sister, Emily. It was a quiet rebellion against the world she had once shaped, a declaration that the future belonged to those who dared to use numbers not as weapons, but as shields. Inside, the once sterile boardrooms had become classrooms filled with light, conversation, and the scrawling of youthful hands across notebooks. Margaret often walked the corridors, her heels now soft against the polished floors, passing students who no longer feared her name but smiled as they greeted her. Leo had become a living symbol of the mission. Though still young, he balanced his studies with his role as the school's youth consultant, helping to shape programs that reached far beyond the walls of the building. He inspired children who once believed finance was the language of the untouchable. He showed them it could be their language, too. His presence at the school was not ceremonial, it was deeply personal. Leo didn't want to sit in the back row of his own story. He wanted to lead. Margaret found herself watching him sometimes from the doorway, marveling at how he carried both curiosity and responsibility with a natural ease. He wasn't just the boy who had changed her, he was now the boy changing the world. Thomas had let go of the last remnants of his corporate life, pouring himself into the foundation and the school with the same precision he once reserved for high-stake mergers. He taught legal courses on corporate accountability, his classrooms filled with young minds eager to build a system they could trust. Helen and Samuel remained Margaret's trusted companions, no longer assistants, no longer hidden strategists, but visible mentors guiding the hospital protection network, which now spanned dozens of communities. They trained teams who could audit, defend, and rescue institutions on the brink of collapse. Margaret often reflected on the strange symmetry of it all. The very skills she had once used to dismantle had now become the same tools that built. The Foundation's reach had saved countless hospitals from slipping into the hands of those who saw them as mere assets. The stories of these rescues became case studies at the school, each one a living chapter in the book of what was possible when the right people chose to stand up. Leo's own book soon followed, a slender volume with simple diagrams and short chapters written for children like himself. Numbers That Protect, A Kid's Guide to Ethical Finance, became an unexpected success. Translated into multiple languages, its colorful illustrations making financial concepts accessible to even the youngest readers. When Margaret held the first printed copy in her hands, she ran her fingers across the title, her heart swelling with a quiet, profound pride. Leo had written what she never could, a story that belonged to everyone. Her life, once marked by relentless ambition, had softened into days of shared meals, handwritten letters, and a rhythm of purpose that felt earned. Letters arrived from across the country, notes from young students, teachers, and even skeptical accountants who had found courage in Leo's story. They spoke of learning, of standing up, of protecting what mattered. Margaret read every single one. One autumn morning, as golden leaves gathered in lazy spirals outside her window, Thomas approached her with a hesitant smile. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," he said, his voice carrying a tenderness she had come to cherish. In walked a girl no older than 6, her dark curls bouncing as she peeked shyly from behind her father. "This is Lily," Thomas said softly. "Your granddaughter." The air caught in Margaret's chest. She knelt carefully, meeting Lily's curious gaze. "Hello," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Lily studied her for a long moment, then offered a small, decisive nod and slipped her hand into Margaret's. It was a simple gesture, but it cracked open a door Margaret had believed forever sealed. Their family, fractured, distant, had quietly begun again. Leo remained a constant presence in her life, no longer just as a protege, but as the grandson of her heart. They met almost daily, whether to draft new projects, share lunch on the school's garden bench, or to simply laugh at Leo's latest attempt to teach Emily how to audit the cookie jar. He had become her family, not by blood, but by choice. Margaret's legacy was no longer a portfolio, nor a marble monument etched with her name. It lived in the ripple of safe hospitals, in classrooms filled with questions, in Leo's bold visions, and in the children who now believed that they, too, could hold the pen that shaped the story. The numbers that once isolated her now bound her to those she loved. They were no longer cold calculations, they were promises, they were guardians, they were bridges. Leo and Margaret continued to build together, sketching new initiatives on napkins over tea, dreaming aloud of how the next generation could inherit something better than what they had received. You know, Leo told her one afternoon, as they mapped a plan for a rural hospital, the best part about this math is that it never really ends. Margaret smiled, the weight of old regrets no longer sharp against her ribs. Neither does the counting, she replied. But some accounts aren't for profit, they're for love. In the quiet warmth of their partnership, they had rewritten what it meant to leave something behind. They had kept the books open, not for wealth, but for hearts still waiting to be counted.